A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The Pharisees went and plotted to entrap Jesus in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. Then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The Gospel of the Lord. In today's Gospel, the Pharisees try to trap Jesus by this question regarding the payment of tax. They think they have got him one way or another. If Jesus tells the Jews to pay taxes to their Roman enemies, he will be considered a traitor by his own people. If he answers, on the other hand, that the Jews should not pay tax to the Roman officials, they will arrest him. Either way, the Pharisees think Jesus' ministry is finished. But Jesus, knowing their intention, gives a remarkable answer that not only silences his enemies, but provides us with a profound truth regarding our relationship with God and the secular society in which we live and the duties we owe to each. Jesus tells the Pharisees to produce a coin and points out that since it is marked by an image of Caesar, since his face is on it and his inscription, they should give to Caesar that which belongs to him. But, he adds, give to God the things which belong to God. What's remarkable about this response is what it implies for us today, because the coin is not the only thing imprinted with an image. We are also deeply marked. In Genesis chapter 1, it states that we have been created in the very image and likeness of God. This image goes to the very depth of our nature. There is not any part of us that is not marked by God's image. Furthermore, in our baptism and confirmation, we are again marked, this time sacramentally, with the very seal or imprint of the Lord, stamped in our being, marked out not only in creation, but more importantly, redemption. Therefore, since we bear God's image, God's mark, we belong to Him and are to give back to God our entire lives. This then answers the often difficult and tangled question of separation in church and state, or how our relationship with God intersects with our civil responsibilities. Jesus was certainly not denying Caesar or the state their occasional coins of tribute. Rather, he affirmed the fact that, as humans, we owe to God the total tribute of our minds and hearts. In the same way that Caesar looks for his image on a coin, God looks for his own image throughout our lives. What does this mean in our practical day-to-day living? Since we owe our lives to God, then everything we do ultimately is a rendering back of ourselves to God in every thought, inclination, decision, every promise and commitment, every vow. In scriptural language, St. Paul puts it this way, quote, "So whether you eat or sleep or whatever you do it all to the glory of God." End of quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Let us now go a little deeper and ask, practically speaking, how do we render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God what belongs to God? The answer is in at least two ways. First, a good part of our life is taken up with labor in the secular realm. On the one hand, work can be viewed as simply instrumental, a means to an end. I will put food on the table and that's it. A necessary evil. I don't like my job. I can't wait to retire. I thank God it's Friday. I hate when it's Monday morning. This is a minimal view that does not take account of God. When we put on the mind of Christ, work can become so much more, even a vocation, an offering to God, and if necessary, a sacrificial offering. Take, for example, two building contractors collaborating together to build a large house in a residential neighborhood. A curious neighbor stops by to inquire as to the project and asks each worker to describe the venture and their involvement. The first contractor replies rather curtly, "I am putting up a house and I'm making money." The second pauses to consider the question and explains, "I am helping to build a residence for a lovely family. It might even turn into a castle or a cathedral." Here we have two workers at the same project, but the second is clearly doing it for the glory of God. This story of the two workers really can be applied to every one of us in whatever job we have, in whatever state in life we find ourselves in, whether young or old, whether we are a student in school, whether we are raising children, or whether an executive. If we live with the intent of doing everything to the glory of God, like the second worker, it will have profound implications not only on our spiritual well-being, but on the society in which we live. Our life can be sanctified as we invest the sacred into the profane. When we bring that attitude into every aspect of our life, everything changes. Our care for the job, the customers we serve, our co-workers, they will notice something different in us, which is the image of Christ. They will not be able to verbalize it, but they will notice and begin to ask. Another major aspect of our life is marriage and family. Marriage is a secular institution insofar as it is state-regulated. You need a license to enter into it. But the Catholic Church has elevated it to a sacrament. This is our entry point to influence the culture. When we make use of that sacramental grace unique to marriage, then our homes become the domestic church to the glory of God. Inspired by grace, decisions can be made that are countercultural. For example, the family prays together and are inspired to set aside money each week for the poor. That may mean cutting back on expenditures, not living as lavish, not purchasing every bauble or knick-knack that is advertised, staying away from expensive brand names, and opting instead for more generic merchandise so that we are in solidarity with the poor. This is how we live influential lives. Today we celebrate World Mission Sunday. It is a day set aside by the Church when all Christians are to reflect on their responsibility to live the Church's mission in the world, which includes giving money to the poor, feeding the hungry, and the other corporal works of mercy. But primarily, the Church's mission is to bring the gospel to others, to announce the good news, to bring about the reign of God. The best way to do this is to live in the image of Christ, to strive for holiness right in the midst of our active, hectic schedules where we most intersect with culture and our society. Finally, our readings provide an opportunity to go still deeper into an area of potential conflict when the state overreaches into the realm of the sacred, when the laws of the state are not in harmony with the demands of the moral order, to the dignity of the human person, and to the teachings of the Church. St. Peter, in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, gives the basic answer. He and the apostles were being pressured by those in authority not to preach the gospel publicly. His response? Quote, "We must obey God rather than men." End of quote. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2242, adds important direction on this point. Quote, "The citizen is obliged in conscience not to follow the directives of civil authorities when they are contrary to the demands of the moral order, to the fundamental rights of persons or the teachings of the gospel. Refusing obedience to civil authorities when their demands are contrary to those of an upright conscience finds its justification in the distinction between serving God and serving the political community. Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." End of quote. In the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, the English title, the Church in the Modern World puts it this way, quote, When citizens are under the oppression of a public authority which oversteps its competence, they should still not refuse to give or to do what is objectively demanded of them by the common good. But it is legitimate for them to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens against the abuse of this authority within the limits of the natural law and the law of the gospel." End of quote. This brings us to one of the most important and foundational elements of Catholic morality that has been in place since the creation of humankind, that is, the natural law. To understand its operation, it is helpful to see how the natural law relates to the eternal law, the divine law, and the positive law. Eternal law is simply the order of creation in the mind of God, that is, His overall providential plan of creation for the governance of and happiness of all things. The eternal law is the mind of God by which the world was made and governed. All law finds its first and ultimate truth in the eternal law. The eternal law of God is communicated to us in two ways. First, in the divine law, that is, God's revelation through Scripture and tradition, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. The second is by natural law, that is, what God has written in our hearts by our being created in His image and likeness. In other words, by virtue of our rational nature, we have the capacity through reason to know basic moral truths. Finally, there is positive law, that is, man-made rules such as traffic regulations or the tax or criminal codes, that is, laws that govern our society. How all of this fits within the issue of faith and culture is crucial to see. It is explained in the Catechism, paragraph 1959. Quote, "The natural law, the Creator's very good work, provides the solid foundation on which man can build the structure of moral rules to guide his choices. It also provides the indispensable moral foundation for building the human community. Finally, it provides the necessary basis for the civil law, with which it is connected, whether by a reflection that draws conclusions from its principles or by additions of a positive and juridical nature." End of quote. In other words, positive or human laws must not contravene the natural law, because otherwise it ultimately is against the mind of God, that is, the eternal law. As Martin Luther King Jr. said in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, quote, "An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law." End of quote. This is why in the Nuremberg trials following World War II, the natural law was used by the prosecution to bolster its claim that the Nazis were guilty of crimes against humanity. Some of the defendants were actually arguing that they should not be prosecuted at all because they were simply following validly passed civil laws of the state, such as forced sterilization and euthanasia, aimed at excluding the unfit from the community, that eventually escalated to broader genocidal policies like the final solution. One can see the same reasoning used by St. Thomas More in his trial for treason, where he stated against King Henry VIII's claim to be the head of the Church in England, quote, "Some men think the earth is round, others think it flat. It is a matter capable of question. But if it is flat, will the king's command make it round? And if it is round, will the king's command flatten it?" In other words, just as the king's command cannot change a physical law of nature, so human positive law must not contradict the natural law of morality that is written in our hearts by the mind of God. Finally, the question can be asked, especially in view of what is transpiring in some of our cities today: how far can one resist the state when civil authorities go beyond the demands of the moral order and infringe on basic rights of persons? The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts this limit on civil protests in paragraph 2243. Quote, "Armed resistance to oppression by political authority is not legitimate unless all of the following conditions are met. 1. There is certain grave and prolonged violation of fundamental rights. 2. All other means of redress have been exhausted. 3. Such resistance will not provoke worse disorders. 4. There is a well-founded hope of success. And 5. It is impossible reasonably to foresee any better solution. End of quote. Let us conclude with St. Paul's second reading, addressing the small Christian community of Thessalonica that has just been established in the midst of the surrounding pagan Roman Empire. It is only about 20 years after the death of Christ. Paul thanks the community for living their lives in active faith, fervent love, and enduring hope, because he knows the impact it will have on converting the culture. As we know from history, the Christian faith spread very rapidly in the first couple of centuries, so much so that the Roman Empire was Christianized. We are called to do the same today in our culture on this Mission Sunday. We do it by living out today's gospel message, by rendering to Caesar that which is Caesar's, that is, obeying civil authority and just laws, paying all lawful taxes, voting on election day, praying for our leaders, all of which certainly contributes to the common good. But far more than this, we are called to render our entire lives back to God in whose image we are made, thereby sanctifying our culture by being witnesses to those around us, by being salt and light in the midst of the world. So we pray for the grace to live out today's gospel, rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that belong to him. Our very lives, our hopes, our dreams, our commitments, everything to the glory of God.